Good evening.
Mm-hmm.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Innovation in Linguistics talk series presented by the journal Cognitive Semantics. Today, I am thrilled to host the 11th lecture in this series. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to our journal. Cognitive Semantics, abbreviated as COSE, is a peer-reviewed international journal focused on exploring the intricate relationship between meaning and the mind. We welcome submissions of unpublished research from all theoretical perspectives within linguistics. Our founding editor and editor-in-chief is Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee from Beihang University. Thomas, would you like to say hello to our speaker for today and to our participants?
Hi, good evening. I'm happy to invite our editorial assistant, Dr. Liu Na, to introduce the talk theory and the journal and our speaker today. I think the whole floor is yours, Liu Na.
Thank you, Thomas. I will move on. The journal's consulting editors include George Lakoff, Roland Langerker, and Lana Telmi. Our review editor is Professor Ed Fuyin, and our associate editors are Professor Dylan Glynn, Martin Helper, and Francisco Reyes de Mendoza. We are supported by a dedicated team of editorial assistants, Gao Zerong, Li Zifan, and Yang Yuhang from Beihang University, and myself, Liu Na from Central China Normal University. As we mark the 11th lecture in our Innovation in Linguistics series, you can find information about our previous 10 lectures and watch their recordings on our WeChat platform or our YouTube channel. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Stefan Hartmann. Professor Stefan Hartmann is an associate professor of German linguistics at Heinrich-Heine University Düsseldorf. His research interests span historical linguistics, corpus linguistics, cognitive linguistics, construction grammar, first language acquisition, multilingualism, and language evolution. He currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the journals Language and Cognition and Constructions, and is a board member of both the International Cognitive Linguistics Association and the German Cognitive Linguistics Association. The topic of today's lecture is Individual Differences in Constructional Productivity, a Distributional Semantic Approach. Without further ado, I hand over the floor to Professor Hartmann.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to take part in this lecture series, this highly prolific lecture series. And today I would like to talk about individual differences in constructional productivity and about productivity in general. As many of you know, productivity is a topic that has been discussed quite a lot, both in construction grammar and in other usage-based approaches to language, especially in morphology. And perhaps one reason why it is such a contested topic is because there are different perspectives and different dimensions that we have to unwrap if we want to fully understand the phenomenon. Now, I don't claim that I have fully understood the phenomenon, and probably nobody ever will, but maybe we can try to approach this phenomenon in a bit more detail by taking a look at, among other things, the question of what we can learn from taking a look at how individuals potentially differ in the way they use different constructions productively. So here's a brief overview. I would like to first talk a little bit about different readings of productivity and in this context about the role that individual differences may play in understanding productivity. And then I will present two case studies. The case studies are both from German, so I presume that most of you will not be too familiar with German, so I will try to give many translations as well. But the first case study is a nominalization pattern, actually a nominalization pattern that I investigated in my dissertation almost 10 years ago. And I have revisited the data and performed some new analyses with a view to this question of, on the one hand, how can we measure productivity maybe a bit more reliably, and on the other hand, how can we assess individual differences? The second case study concerns comparative correlatives. Comparative correlatives are constructions of the type the X or the wire, which maybe many of you will be familiar with from other contexts because it's one of the go-to constructions in construction grammar, especially the English one, of course. And this will bring me to the question how we can delineate these different related topics or related concepts of productivity and creativity, and how we can relate it to this nexus of individual and population. Okay, so let's dive in and first take a look at how the term productivity is actually used in the literature. So I've randomly selected a couple of quotes, and we have, for example, Tomasello talking about children being able to use language productively. We have compounding and suffixation as productive patterns of word formation. And here we have another quote in which we actually have a paper title in which the authors discuss the productivity of bilingual borrowing. So we already see that there are quite different readings of the term productivity, and we have to disentangle these different readings a little bit and have to be clear what we are talking about. Maybe one of the most famous uses of the term productivity comes from Hockett's paper on the design features of language, in which he posited productivity as one of his 13 design features of language. And he defined productivity as the capacity to say things that have never been said or heard before, and yet to be understood by other speakers of that language. Hockett, however, has also used the term productivity referring to the productivity of patterns rather than the productivity of an entire language. So in 1958, he spoke about the productivity of any pattern and said that the productivity of any pattern is the relative freedom with which speakers coin new grammatical forms by it. So this can be related to the probably most widespread definition of productivity, that productivity is the likelihood or the propensity of a pattern to be extended to new cases. And there are two main ways in which productivity has been operationalized. On the one hand, there's a binary reading of productivity, which means that a pattern is either extensible or not extensible, so you can either form new coinages with it or you can't. Whereas from a gradual point of view, we can conceive of productivity as the degree of extensibility. So from the binary point of view, we can say that a pattern is either productive or not productive. To take an example from German, in German there's a word formation pattern with the suffix icht, and we have it in things like kehricht, which is rubbish, and a couple of other words, but not many. And these few words are relics from a previously productive word formation pattern that is not productive in present-day language anymore, so we can't form any new coinages with it. From a gradual point of view, we can distinguish different patterns in terms of the degree to which they can be extended. And we all know that there are some patterns that can easily be extended and for which there are hardly any constraints on productivity, whereas others are fairly constrained in the domains to which they can be extended. This is what Adele Goldberg has famously called the puzzle of partial productivity. So many constructions in language are not fully productive, so we can't extend them freely to anything that crosses our mind, but usually there are some constraints, and grasping these constraints is one of the main tenets of research on productivity, if we conceive of productivity as a gradual concept. We can also see this concept of productivity at work when we take a look at Q&A forums, where we sometimes find questions like, is this and that a word? So here are some examples from German where people ask, is this a word? Does this exist? And all these examples that we see here are complex words, are words that are coined with the help of certain word formation patterns. And this indicates that people are unsure about the constraints of the word formation pattern in question. There are a couple of other examples, and again, people always ask, is this a word or not? And this kind of shows that even lay people are aware of the fact that constructions, in this case, morphological constructions, differ in their productivity and cannot be freely extended to anything and everything. If we take a look at the first use, or what is said to be the first use of the word productivity, we see a binary view of productivity. That's in this Grammar of the Romance Languages by Friedrich Dietz. And here we see that forms have remained alive and productive. And this is, as I said, supposedly the first use of the term productive in the linguistic literature. And here we also see that Dietz was kind of aware of many of the discussions that we still have about productivity and about the question, why do we actually coin new words? This he basically writes that we often have a need for naming new things or new concepts, and the most convenient way to do that is derivation. And derivation is actually the domain where the concept of productivity was most frequently used and applied. And already in 1987, Franz Reiner, a morphologist, disentangled six different readings of productivity, distinguishing them by whether they are synchronically oriented, diachronically oriented, or indifferent with regard to synchrony and diachrony. And importantly, he showed that these different readings of productivity rely on a number of concepts, some of which are problematic in themselves, like, for example, actual words versus usual words and possible words. If we go back to the 1980s and take a look at the work of people like Harald Bayen, Jaap van Male, Reat Boy, and many others, there was this big literature where people debated how we can best operationalize productivity, in this case, morphological productivity. And there were many proposals, and each of these proposals came with a number of problems. Like, for example, if we have a definition of productivity that relies on the concept of possible words, how do we define possible words? And more importantly, how do we operationalize possible words, and what's the difference between a possible word and actually a tested word, and lots of other questions that kind of follow from these different definitions. I won't go through these different definitions. These are just as a little reminder that we're dealing with a concept that's kind of elusive, and where we have many different proposals of how to define it and how to operationalize it. Johanna Barthal even distinguished 19 potential synonyms of productivity, some of them perhaps more contested than others. But importantly, she also tried to categorize them and to carve out 3 sub-concepts in which we can, or under which we can kind of summarize these many different construals of productivity. So these are generality, regularity, and extensibility. So generality means that something has a wide coverage or is open and not restricted. Regularity means that something is rule-based and transparent and or compositional. And extensibility, which is arguably the most relevant concept when it comes to productivity, is that something occurs with novel items and or develops new functions. And while most definitions or most operationalizations of productivity somehow capture aspects of all 3 of them, extensibility is probably the one that is the most relevant one. Also, I would argue that we can distinguish different ways in which the term productivity is used, relating to the level of abstraction and the level of analysis. So on the one hand, productivity is sometimes seen as an inherent property of linguistic patterns when we say that a pattern is productive or a pattern becomes productive. However, from a construction grammar point of view, of course, we would maybe rather say that it's not an inherent property in that sense, because that would kind of presuppose that we are conceiving of language as something that exists as something in its own right outside of the minds of language users. We would rather maybe say that it's part of the knowledge about usage conventions of linguistic patterns that we share in a community of language users. Also, productivity can be seen as a result of language use when we say that a pattern is used productively. And of course, this is something that is closely tied to the first definition of, or to the first way of understanding productivity. And last but not least, productivity is also seen as a measurable value. And of course, that's also something that follows from the first 2 definitions. So when we have productivity as knowledge about usage conventions, then this is a result of language use, and to some extent vice versa. And what we are trying to measure when we try to operationalize productivity as a measurable value is, of course, the result of this feedback loop between language use and our knowledge of individual constructions. So from a usage-based perspective, we can see productivity as the result of linguistic knowledge about usage restrictions or usage constraints. That's what I mentioned before, the puzzle of partial productivity, which is maybe not so much of a puzzle as we will see later, but rather something that follows fairly naturally from the way we learn and use languages. And the constraints of productivity can be of different kinds. So we can have grammatical constraints. For example, with some word formation patterns, we have input constraints in the sense that, for example, some patterns only take verbs as their input, other patterns only take nouns as their input, and so on. There can be semantic constraints. So some patterns are largely restricted to, for example, words with a negative semantic prosody. So there's this famous example from Stefanovic and Griese's first constructions paper, in which they investigate this X is waiting to happen pattern. And they show that typically this pattern combines with words with a negative connotation. So like there's an accident waiting to happen, for example. Also, there can be variety-specific differences in productivity. So patterns can differ in their productivity in across regional varieties. And one example for this, again, from German, so I live in Germany, but when I go to another German-speaking country, like, for example, Austria, I realize that people use very different constructions sometimes. So, for example, in Austria, people often use the prefix ur for as a kind of emphasizing suffix. So when you say that something is really, really cool, you can say something like urcool in Austrian German, which would sound a bit odd in the German that people in Germany speak. And last but not least, and that's what I would like to focus on today, among other things, is that we can also assume individual differences in productivity. For example, my colleague Jakob Niels has done a very interesting study in which he investigated the let alone construction, another of the constructions that have been revisited time and again in construction grammar research. And he has shown that William Faulkner really loves this construction and uses it a lot, and can perhaps be seen as one of the leaders of change, if you will, one of the people who kind of helped to popularize this construction on a larger level. And in many cases, we can assume that, well, there are such kind of leaders of change in a way that are a bit ahead of their time in the use of certain construction. And that's what makes individual productivity very interesting, also from a sociolinguistic perspective, because then we can ask, who are these people, which sociolinguistic factors may play a role in whether or not a pattern that one person or a small group of person uses becomes widespread in the linguistic community. Many of you will be familiar with the productivity cline that Johanna Bartal has proposed, and in which kind of these different notions of regularity, schematicity, and extensibility come together, where we have this cline from, on the one end, open extensible schemas to analogical extension on the other end of the cline. And we can kind of relate these different poles to, on the one hand, what is sometimes called F creativity. So F creativity is a kind of creativity where we don't invent new things, but rather stick to existing rules. Whereas on the other hand, we can relate analogy to what is sometimes called E-creativity, so extending creativity. You could say rule bending or rule breaking creativity, where we actually make up something new. And this can also be related to this idea of extravagance that I've done some work on, especially with my colleague Tobias Ungerer, taking up this concept by Martin Haspelmath and earlier Rudi Keller, a former colleague from Düsseldorf, who had this idea that language users sometimes use constructions to stand out socially, basically. And this idea by Keller was taken up by Hasselmatt and termed extravagance, and we kind of have these principles that go against each other on the one hand, or that balance each other out. On the one hand, the principle of extravagance, or the maxim of extravagance, which says talk in a way that you are socially successful and that you stand out from the crowd. And on the other hand, the maxim of conformity, which says that you should talk like the others talk. And in our own language use, we usually balance between these two principles. And to some extent, we can relate this to productivity in the sense that when we do analogical extensions, so when we have a pattern that is actually not productive yet, and we extend it by means of analogy, it is often something that is perceived as extravagant. So one example for analogical extension would be the first few attestations of the gate suffix in English. So we had Watergate in the 1970s, the famous Watergate scandal. And Watergate, of course, was named after the hotel where this kind of eavesdropping scandal took place. And so the scandal itself got the name Watergate, but this was soon extended to other gates, and the initial extension of the pattern obviously was a result of analogical extension. Nowadays, Gate has arguably moved up the productivity climb and more towards an open schema. So there are quite a few gates in English, also in German. So recently, for example, we had Partygate in the UK with Boris Johnson. So that would be an example where we have a pattern that is originally extended via analogical extension, and that arguably opens up, becomes more productive, and can nowadays be used very productively. From a construction grammar point of view, we can also visualize this a little bit. So in the beginning, we have analogical extension, and so we have one pattern, or maybe not even a pattern, but rather an instance, and it is extended via analogy, and then people start to form generalizations over it or form schemas from it. The question to what extent we need generalization is, of course, also something that is a matter of debate. So, for example, there was this Target article by Ben Aimbridge recently, in which he argued in favor of a very strongly exemplar-based perspective on linguistic knowledge, which kind of does away with the concept of generalization, at least to a large extent. He later took many of it back and said, okay, maybe generalization to some extent is something that we do need in linguistic theory. But anyway, for the sake of simplicity, I will just use generalization as a shorthand here, capturing the observation that we can fairly easily extend some patterns, which indicates that we have some meta-knowledge, if you will, about that pattern. And as I said, as a shorthand, I will talk about this as generalization without implying that generalization is necessarily something that is needed in all cases as a cognitively plausible mechanism or cognitively realistic mechanism. And from these generalizations, we can get to more and more new instances, and we end up with an open schema. And if we align this with a productivity line, it looks basically like this. Now, that's something that is kind of undefined as to whether it's something that's happening on the individual level, or rather on the level of a population of language users. The reason why this is so underdetermined is, of course, because the answer is usually it's both. And that's something that's nicely captured in this 5C model of linguistic creativity that Thomas Hoffmann has proposed recently. And of course, creativity and productivity are notions that are closely related, and there are also many debates about how they can be differentiated. So my personal feeling would be that creativity is something that happens more towards the lower end of the productivity line. But of course, the term creativity is sometimes also used for very rule-based and regular extensions in the sense of full productivity. And as I said before, there's also this distinction in the literature between E-creativity and F-creativity, with E-creativity being creativity that extends a pattern, whereas F-creativity is a type of creativity that kind of sticks to the rules. And so in a way, if we take creativity as a cover term for E-creativity and F-creativity, it is to a very large extent arguably coextensive with the concept of productivity. But the important thing in this model by Hoffmann is that it takes into account the role of the individual and the feedback loop between individual and population. So if we take this graph by Thomas Hoffmann, we could basically say that what happens here in the constructicon of an individual language user is what we can see as productivity on the individual level, whereas when we get to the interaction between two and more language users, we enter the community level, and of course we always have a close interaction between these different levels. So what I would like you to take away from what I said in the last 10 minutes or so is that productivity has to be conceived of as a multidimensional concept on various levels. So on the definition level, we have productivity as the result of linguistic knowledge, but also part of linguistic knowledge of a constructional pattern. But also we can differentiate between productivities, quote unquote, at different levels. So the macro level of the individual, the meso level of linguistic varieties, and the micro level of language, the macro level of language as a whole. The first will, of course, be the micro level, where we have the individual. But not only on the definitional level, we have to distinguish different dimensions, but also on the level of operationalization. So when we try to operationalize productivity empirically, when we try to come up with measures of productivity, we also have to check what it actually is that we would like to measure, because in the end, productivity is a mosaic of complementary individual aspects. That's also why so many different ways of measuring and operationalizing productivity have been proposed and still are proposed to this day. So in the next few minutes, I would like to focus on individual differences between language users on the micro level. On the meso level, I would like to take a closer look at differences between text types, which are, of course, not always the ideal proxy for linguistic varieties, registers, or whatever, but at least one proxy that's easy to operationalize. And finally, I would like to briefly talk about complementary measures of productivity on the macro level, but that's something that I will only talk about very briefly and focus on the text type differences and especially the individual differences and what they can tell us. Now, I come from historical linguistics, and I will talk about case studies from diachrony. So why is productivity important from a diachronic point of view? Well, first of all, it's a key concept for understanding language change processes, also because productivity is closely related to competition. So in many cases, we see a kind of pattern where we see an increase or decrease of productivity that is kind of correlated with the increase or decrease of another competing pattern that fulfills similar functions. And so productivity can help us understand not only how, but also why certain processes of language change happen. So linguistic patterns change in productivity over time. I've already mentioned this word formation pattern with icht in German, like kehricht, rubbish, that is completely unproductive today. On the other hand, we have other patterns that gain productivity. And again, I've already mentioned gate with partygate that has also become productive in German. So in Germany, we, for example, had Dirndlgate. So Dirndl is a traditional Bavarian dress, and there was one scandal, I forgot what it was about, but some politician, I think, was wearing a dirndl in an inappropriate context, and that was called Dirndlgate. And another example that I came across recently is this einen X am haben, so literally having an X. In English, that works, having an X, like have a ball, for example. In German, it's very unusual, so maybe that's a lone translation from English, but it's definitely something that we see in certain contexts. So I've brought some examples from the platform formerly known as Twitter, and here we see that people are using this X am haben construction, so having an X construction in very different contexts. So the most frequent example actually is this einen normalen am haben, so have a normal one, which kind of is used as a strongly derogatory way of saying that people defend a position that is anything but normal, but very controversial, actually. But we also see that there are very different contexts, very different other contexts in which the pattern is used. But anyway, I won't talk about this pattern today, although it would be an interesting case study for follow-up research, but rather I will zoom in on two patterns. One of them, as I mentioned before, I've investigated my PhD thesis 10 years ago. That's Umnominalization in German, and that's what I want to focus on today. And I will briefly also talk a little bit about work in progress that I'm currently doing on comparative correlatives. So basically the German equivalent to the English, the Exe, the wire construction. Let's first start with umnominalization. And if you want to replicate this, I've also pasted an OSF link here with the replication data and the script. I think the script doesn't work entirely. I've just double checked it and there's still an error in it, but most of it should work. Umnominalization is a word formation pattern in German that derives nouns from verbs. So if we have a verb like landen, to land, as in the airplane is landing, we can derive something like Landung, landing from it. So it basically works a little bit like the nominal version of ing in English. And that's what I investigated both in my PhD thesis and in a couple of follow-up papers. And I used data from the German text archive, Deutsches Textarchiv. That's a corpus that covers the time span from about 1650, which is the time when, according to the common periodization of German language history, New High German begins. So kind of the variety of German that is still what we use today, even though it's present-day German is not exactly what we had in 1650. But anyway, it covers the time from 1650 to 1900. And from this very large corpus, I compiled a subcorpus that comprises 270 texts with 4,000 words each. Why did I do this? Mainly because the different time slices in the corpus are very unevenly sized, and I wanted to have evenly sized time slices, and that's what I got by taking a balanced sample, balanced for first of all periods, and secondly text types. So there are 4 text types in the entire corpus. I only used 3 of them because the 4th, which are newspapers, is very, very underrepresented in the first few decades, and so I couldn't use it, at least not if I wanted to have a balanced sample. And here we see the frequency distribution of the different text types. So on the left, we see the entire corpus. On the right, we see the small sample that I took, and I called it DTR baby in analogy to the BNC baby, the small version of the British National Corpus. Here we see that it's kind of not 100%, but kind of balanced for text types and 50-year time periods. And in this corpus, I searched for nominalizations. And again, here we see the frequency distribution, and we see the tokens, the types, so the different words, and the hapax legomena, which are the words that are only attested once in the entire corpus. As many of you will know, hapax legomena have often been used as a kind of proxy for productivity, especially in Harald Bayern's productivity measures. One of the most widespread productivity measures is what Bayern 2009 calls potential productivity, which is the number of hapaxes in a given corpus divided by the number of attestations belonging to the pattern in question. So basically, hapaxes divided by tokens. And we will see later on how this measure works for this corpus. First of all, a quick overview of previous research. Before me already, Ulrike Demske has done extensive research on this pattern and has shown that the construction sees a decline in morphological productivity over time, that there's an increase in word formation constraints. So some nominals that could be used in early New High German, so before 1650 quite easily, are not attested anymore in later periods of German. So for example, durative verbs like Glaubung, believing, inquisitive words like Erblühung, blossoming, iterative verbs like Hüstelung, coughing, basically, and verbs of transfer like Gebung, giving, they are all not possible anymore in present-day German. Also, it has been suggested that the pattern sees an increase in nouniness, so that the patterns become more noun-like and less verb-like over time, and that infinitival normalization comes in as a kind of replacement process. Okay, to investigate the productivity of this pattern in more detail, I used the classic productivity measures according to Beihang. And first of all, that's the type frequency or realized productivity, which kind of measures how many types we have in a given time period. And here we see that there's an increase. So over time, we see more and more types of nominals. However, when we take a look at the hapax legomena, so at the words attested only once, then we see that there's a decrease over time. And we see it particularly clearly when we don't use the raw data, but when we rather do a Sif-Mandelbrot extrapolation. That's what we see in the second panel and in the third panel here. So the second panel extrapolates the growth curves for hapax legomena for the data, for the normalization data in the DTR baby corpus for 3 different centuries. So the 3 lines are 3 centuries, and the blue line is the 17th century, the red line is the 18th century, the green line is the 19th century. Why this extrapolation? The reason for that is that it has been shown that this measure of potential productivity, so dividing the hapaxes by the number of tokens belonging to the pattern, has severe shortcomings when we have uneven data. First of all, when we have when we compare different sample sizes, as I've shown you before, that's not the case here because I'm using a balanced corpus that has roughly the same number of attestation or roughly the same number of words for each time slice. But it also has problems when we have differences in the token frequency of the pattern we are investigating. And that's actually the case. So we see a massive increase, not only in the type, but also in the token frequency of normalization, because we have some very, very frequent types. And that's why the different why the results for the different centuries would not be comparable if we used just ordinary potential productivity calculations. And this extrapolation process makes it a bit more comparable and also uses bootstrapping, so kind of takes random samples many, many times and then averages over these samples. And here we see that again, when we take this hapax numbers that are extrapolated and the token numbers that are extrapolated and calculate the productivity over these many, many samples, we see that in the 17th century, we have the highest degree of potential productivity, and then we see a sharp drop to the 18th century and another relatively small, but still significant drop to the 19th century. Now, these different measures can, of course, only be interpreted in combination because they capture different aspects of productivity. So type and token frequency give us an impression of how successful a word formation product is in terms of its usage across the language community, whereas potential productivity gives us a clue to what extent the pattern is actually extended, because the hapax legomena, the words attested only once, are taken as a proxy for new attestations. There have also been a couple of other proposals of how to operationalize productivity. For example, people like Claire Cowie and later Christian Berg have suggested that instead of taking hapaxes as a proxy, we could also take a look at at new formations directly. Now, that's, of course, sometimes a bit problematic when we are dealing with corpora, because, of course, it's sometimes a matter of luck whether or not something ends up in a corpus, but people have developed clever ways of trying to get as closely as possible to the date of first attestation of an instance. For example, my colleague Louise Kempf has actually compared different sources to get the earliest attestation of many different patterns. That's, of course, something that creates a lot of work and cannot be done for many different patterns at once, but in some cases it gives us interesting results and is definitely worth the effort. But I haven't done this here, but rather what I would like to do here is to zoom in on individual differences. And what we see here are the number of hapaxes as a proportion of the total number of attestations of normalizations across text types. So I just realized that I haven't introduced the text types before, so maybe I should do this, because there are 3 text types in this corpus. That's Wissenschaft, science, that's Gebrauchsliteratur, which is a kind of umbrella term for anything that is that has some application, so to say. So that's from cooking recipes to sermons, and it's kind of the other category, you could say, though. So we kind of bin all the items that don't fit into one of the other categories. And the third category is fiction, belletristic, so that's fictional novels. And if we take a look at the proportions of hapaxes across text types and across centuries, so we have 17th, 18th, 19th century here, we see, first of all, some differences between text types. So we have much less nominals in fiction than in functional literature and science. And also, we see a certain propensity towards normalization in scientific texts, especially in the 17th century, which goes back a little, in line with the overall tendency towards or with the overall decline in morphological productivity of the pattern. I've also plotted the distribution of new formations along with hapaxes. So I basically checked which of the items have occurred in previous sections of the corpus, and gauged the kind of the date of first attestation from them. So what we see in orange here are the hapax legomena. The yellow ones are the first attestations, and the blue ones are the others. So for the earliest period, for the 16th century, I gauged the first attestations by checking if a word appears in the reference corpus of Middle High German, of early New High German, which is kind of the predecessor period of the period covered by the German text archive. And again, here we see that the hapaxes and first attestations are distributed a little bit unevenly, but overall there are not so many differences. But what we do see is that there are some outliers. So some authors tend to use normalizations quite a lot, especially here, for example, and also here. But this is due to high token frequencies, not due to a massive number of hapaxes or a massive number of new attestations, although we do have some a fairly high number of new attestations here. We can also take a look at this by taking a look at vocabulary growth curves. So vocabulary growth curves basically look at how the number of tokens and the number of hapax legomena grow over a given text. Here, of course, only limited to normalization, and I've just randomly selected a couple of texts that have a fairly large number of nominals. And again, here we see some differences in the extent to which the individual authors use normalization, and also in their propensity to use hapax legomena with the suffix ung. Okay, I will only very briefly talk about interaction patterns. So it has been shown that normalization interacts with other constructions, especially syntactic constructions. We see that we used to have lots of prepositional constructions of the type in Ansehung, in view of, also lots of light verb constructions and determiner constructions. And the interaction with these syntactic constructions can partly explain the developmental path of normalization more generally. And the productivity of the word formation construction partly depends on the productivity of the syntactic constructions in which it occurs. For example, this construction with prepositional constructions that declines over time, and that might be one of the reasons why some nominals have fallen out of use, because they mostly occurred in this particular syntactic construction. Okay, and that finally brings me to semantic aspects, which is one of the main things that I wanted to talk about. And given the time, I might actually skip comparative correlatives or talk about them very briefly. But I think it's worthwhile to take a look at semantic aspects in a bit more detail, because if we see productivity as something that has to do with constraints, then of course we are also dealing with semantic constraints in many cases. And how can we operationalize semantics? One of the more popular ways that has been fleshed out in recent work is to use distributional semantics, is to use semantic vector spaces. And by using distributional semantics, we can carve out individual usage profiles. As many of you will know, the idea of distributional semantics goes back to this idea by Firth that you shall know a word by the company it keeps. So we assume that the context allows for drawing conclusions on semantic properties of linguistic units. So words that are similar will occur in similar contexts. Words that are not similar will occur in very distinct linguistic contexts. And these linguistic units are usually words, and words occurring in similar contexts tend to have similar meanings. And we operationalize this with semantic vector space models in which words are kind of transformed to numbers, and these numbers are entered into vectors. And then we have something like this, where we have the words that we want to, or whose similarity we want to figure out, and we have a certain window of the context that we take into account. And in this particular example, I have Zivilisierung and Zivilisation, so kind of the two different readings of civilization. On the one hand, civilization in the sense of culture, on the other hand, civilization in the sense of a process. And if we take a look at the context here, then we see that Zivilisierung goes along with words like Eroberung, which is like inquisition, conquest. Sorry, Eroberung is conquest, and Boden, territory, continent, and so on. Whereas Zivilisation, the one in blue, civilization is occurs together with Kultur, culture, Raum, space, Welt, world, europäisch, European, Seele, soul, and so on. So already from these different contexts, we see that these words, even though they go back to the same base word, have developed quite different meanings. And these context words are then entered into a bag of words, basically, and then we calculate their similarity or dissimilarity using measures of similarity. In this case, I used word2vec, which is a family of model architectures to represent words as vectors. And in this case, I used a skipgram model as implemented in the R package word vectors. And I used T-stochastic distributed neighbor embeddings for the visual representation of results. And what we see is that we see fairly clear individual differences in the semantic spectrum of nominals that are observable for different writers. So if I take a look at this, just a second, I have to switch to this Shiny app for a second, and for this I have to share my screen quickly, and here we go. So now you should see this this very probably very confusing cloud of words. So first of all, I will select all of them, and that's kind of the semantic space that normalization occupies here. So this is all words that are attested in normalization over the 3 centuries that I investigated. And the red ones are the hapax legomena, the brownish ones are the first attestations, and the blue ones are the ones that are already attested previously. And if we now don't select all of them, but rather take a look at individual authors, and I will first limit the view to authors from the domain of fiction writing in the 16th century, then we see that they differ in the extent to which they use the pattern, and also in the position that they use, or that the instances they use occupy in the available semantic space. So this guy, for example, is quite broad all over the place, but there are also others where the instances are kind of skewed to certain domains, as we can gauge from the different positions in this semantic space. And some of them, of course, hardly have any attestations at all. And this also allows us to kind of compare different text types and different centuries. So we have seen before that in the case of fiction, there's a relatively low propensity towards using this normalization pattern, whereas in especially in scientific texts, there's a higher propensity, which we also see by the higher proportion of hapax legomena, and also the very broad coverage. So there's basically nominals from all over the place. here. And yeah, if you want, you can play around with this a little bit more. If you follow this OSF link that I showed you before, then you can replicate this. Now I'm going back to the presentation, and I will probably have to change the screen again. And here we go. Yes. So here are just two examples that I chose very randomly. So one author, two authors from roughly the same time, one of them having or leaning towards works from the domain of health, the others from the domain of technology, which of course also has to do with the topics that are treated in these texts. So as an interim conclusion, we see that individuals differ in the extent they use normalization and in the semantic scope of the pattern. And to some extent, this is certainly due to confounding factors. Most obviously, the fact that different texts have different topics, but to some extent, we can perhaps also say that different authors differ in the way they use the construction and also in their propensity to use the construction. One potential follow-up study would be to compare the semantic coverage of normalization with that of a competing pattern or several competing patterns, especially with infinitival normalization. Okay, now I've talked for a bit more than an hour, so I will only very briefly summarize the second case study on comparative correlatives, which is constructions of the type the Xer, the Yer, like the older, the wiser, which consist of an antecedent and a consequent. And what I did here was I followed up on previous work by Chirayu Tarinkaron on the diachronic development of German comparative correlatives, in which he showed that this pattern has undergone interesting developments over time. So first of all, concerning the connectors that I used, and I focus on this period, again, the New High German period from 1650 onwards. And what we see here is that the pattern has undergone a change in the syntactic position of antecedent and or the word order in antecedent, in apodosis and protasis. So first we have the verb in the last position in both apodosis and protasis, and later on we have the verb in the second position in the protasis. And the connectors that are used in present-day German and also in earlier stages of New High German are je in the protasis and umso or desto in the apodosis. So je mehr ich esse, desto dicker werde ich. The more I eat, the fatter I get. And what I wanted to know is, most importantly, if we can find individual differences in the usage patterns of comparative correlatives, and especially of complex comparative correlatives, so of comparative correlatives that deviate from the canonical pattern, for example, by having more than one apodosis or more than one protasis. And that's what I investigated by taking a closer look again at the DTA baby corpus that we already saw before. Here we see the number of hits, and to investigate the second question that I would like to focus on here, I wanted to pursue the hypothesis that these non-canonical comparative correlatives can be seen as kind of extravagant patterns in which people want to speak in such a way that they are noticed. And to operationalize it, I devised a kind of index in which I tried to gauge to what extent these instances of comparative correlatives deviate from the canonical pattern. So they deviate from the canonical pattern if the apodosis is in the preposition rather than in the postposition. So the normal order would be protasis, apodosis. And if you have the order apodosis, protasis, this is kind of salient. It's also salient if you have more than one protasis or more than one apodosis. And also if you have another phrase type than an adjective phrase in one or both of the clauses. And here we see that, again, we see a couple of text type differences to some extent, especially in this weird umbrella category called functional literature. We see an interesting up and down pattern with a heyday around 1600, where people apparently tend towards fairly complex comparative correlatives. Also in the scientific literature, we see a slight upward movement and then a slight downward curve again, whereas in the category of fiction, all of this happens on a much lower level, which kind of conforms with our expectations in the sense that we can expect that maybe fictional literature is a bit closer to, let's say, everyday language, whereas scientific literature and to some extent what is called functional literature here, and which also goes in the direction of scientific literature, tends to use more complex structures and tends to be conceptually more in the written domain and further away from spoken language. And again, we see interesting individual differences if we take this salience or complexity index and map it across the different authors. We see again that there are some leaders of change. And what I find particularly interesting is how we kind of see this shift to the right, where we see that a couple of authors in the 1st century, especially in the domain of fiction, really love complex comparative correlatives, whereas others hardly use them at all. And later on, we see a small bias to the right, a move to the right, and that's something that we see across all 3 text type categories. And we also see that whereas in the first period, we only have a few outliers that use more complex comparative correlatives, in later periods, it's basically, with a few exceptions, everyone, at least in the 2, at least in functional literature and science, whereas in fiction, there are still many people who don't use complex comparative correlatives at all. And that also becomes clear if we take the birth year of the different authors as another proxy. Here we see that, again, that younger authors tend to adopt complex comparative correlatives a bit earlier than others. Okay, so as for comparative correlatives, we see that there's a high degree of text type variation, but also we see individual differences in the use of this pattern. And we see especially clear differences between fiction and the other 2 text types. And I would argue that this can partly be explained by stylistic factors and perhaps also by extravagance that may have played a key role in the emergence and spread of non-canonical comparative correlatives. So what do we take away from all of this? One overarching question is certainly how can we better understand productivity? And I tried to show that from a usage-based point of view, productivity should be understood as a mosaic of different factors that are closely interrelated and that can only be fully understood if we take their interplay into account. And if we also take different levels of analysis into account, especially the interaction between individual and population that has been discussed quite extensively under the umbrella of complex adaptive systems in the last 10, 15 years. And methodologically, this entails that we should combine different relevant measures and take interaction patterns with other constructions into account, which I've started to do here, but which of course can be developed much further than I did here. Now a couple of open questions remain. For example, how does productivity relate to creativity and extravagance? That's also something that's closely tied to the question of the role of the individual, because in the end, it's individuals who want to stand out from the crowd. And if the term extravagance makes any sense, then it makes sense on the level of the individual. Also, the question is, what's the right level of abstraction for assuming productivity? Should we, does it make sense to measure productivity on the level of the individual? And if so, how can we conceptualize the relationship between productivity on the individual level and productivity on other levels, like the level of the entire language community, the level of individual dialects, regional acts, registers, language varieties, and so on. Also, I've used the term salience earlier on, which is, of course, also a dangerous thing to do because salience is also a very contested term. And so one question is, how does productivity relate to salience, and also how does it relate to competition? And now I revealed that I've used this this slide before because I used it at a conference where we had lots of psycholinguistic talks. And of course, that's something that is a perspective that's indispensable for understanding productivity as well. And so we need psycholinguistic approaches as a complement to what I've presented today to fully understand productivity, especially if we want to see productivity as something that can happen on the level of the individual. And there is currently lots of work going on in this direction. And yeah, there's exciting work coming up that can be related to all of what I've been talking about in the future. So when we talk about productivity, I have argued that we should tease apart various factors. So we should, on the one hand, talk about productivity on the level of the individual, which kind of means that individuals make use of ad hoc formations rather than rote-learned forms. And this actually goes beyond what I've talked about today and what we can measure with corpus linguistic methods, because it can also entail that when different persons use the same instance of a construction, it can be a productive coinage for one person and a kind of rote-learned form for the other, because one of them has potentially heard it before and internalized it, entrenched it, has it kind of available as an entrenched form, whereas the other has made it up on the spot, not knowing that other people have used it before. So that's, of course, a challenge, also a methodological challenge that requires the triangulation of different methods. The second level would be productivity on the level of linguistic constructions, so the degree to which a pattern is applied to new forms, which can then be seen as a proxy to the degree to which individual language users make use of ad hoc formations. And finally, we have productivity on the level of processes that give rise to constructions. So that would be the degree to which a certain process, like, for example, borrowing, contributes to the extension of the constructicon of a language. Okay, that's it. thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments and ideas.
Thank you, Professor Stefan Hart. So thank you for this wonderful and informative talk. Before we move on to the Q&A session, I will briefly summarize this talk. So correct me if I get you wrong. In this talk, Professor Hartmann unites two emerging research areas. One is individual language user differences in constructionalist approach, and the other is the concept of productivity in morphology and syntax. Recent discussions have explored productivity with a focus on individual and register variation. One method for investigating this is distributional semantics, which analyzes word similarities and dissimilarities based on contextual usage. Professor Hartmann examines how distributional semantics can be used to access semantics and individual differences in construction usage, highlighting its potential and limitations through two case studies. So thank you for this wonderful talk again. And I see Dr. Jack Meng asks two questions in the chat. Oh, three questions.
Ah, nice.
Mm-hmm.
Vocabulary. Okay, I'll just read the question. So the first question is about the vocabulary growth. Do you think with the increase of corpus size to the infinity, the Harpax frequency will decrease, will display a rise-fall pattern and finally approximate to zero? Yes, I think when we do this, that's usually what we see, although it very much depends on the pattern and it depends on the number of tokens that we have available, but the expected pattern is indeed that at some point the number of Harpaxes will, of course, fade out and will approximate zero. So the second question is, if we want to measure the productivity of a certain word formation like blending or compounding, do you think we should include those eponyms, toponyms, and brand names as well? Oh, that's a very interesting question. Also, for at least two reasons. So one of them is that what I've been talking about now was assessing the productivity of very specific individual patterns. But of course, it's also interesting to take a more abstract perspective and to take a look at patterns in a broader sense, like what you say with blending, compounding. And in this case, it's of course always a big question what we should take into account, both in terms of the degree of lexicalization. So in many cases we have terms that used to be compositional but are not compositional anymore in present-day language, and so the question arises: should we take them into account as instances of the pattern, or should we get rid of them because maybe present-day language users will not be aware that they are instances of the pattern? Usually we tend to keep them in, also because there are formal similarities that make it seem legitimate to assume that language users do make a connection between this instance and the pattern, even though semantically it might not be connected to the pattern anymore. But when it comes to proper names like toponyms, for example, that's of course, and especially brand names, that's of course a question that has to be answered individually for each study, and I think there are good reasons to not take them into account in many cases, one of them being that in many cases the toponyms might be extremely frequent, and especially the brand names may be quite frequent and kind of distort the overall picture. But in other cases, it might also be justified to leave them in if we can assume that language users do make a connection between these instances and the overarching pattern. And there's another question you mentioned at the very beginning, that affixation is the most productive word formation process, but I think according to the OED, compounding is the most productive type. Do you mean in German affixation is more productive than compounding? I'm not sure if I said that. If I said it, I take it back because I would also say that in especially in German, compounding is extremely productive. What I maybe meant is that suffixation, which I investigated here, is the most productive derivation process in German. Yeah, so yeah, I can't remember what I said, but if I said it, then you should take it with a grain of salt.
Thank you, Professor Hartmann, for answering all the questions. Your answers are very enlightening and informative. Actually, I have a follow-up question to the one last question, that is about whether affixation is more productive than compounding. Because in Mandarin Chinese, we usually have, when we use verbs, we use compounds more. Yes, because affixation is non-existent, I think, in Mandarin Chinese. So, yes, in Mandarin Chinese, I think compounding is more productive. And another question that is related to your open questions and the tentative answers, especially productivity on the level of processes that gave rise to constructions. I have a question that is, when we do diachronic studies in Chinese, we usually, because we only have some corpora that dates back to old Chinese, but actually before this period, some constructions have formed. So it's a bit difficult for us to explore the diachronic change or the formation of some canonical constructions in Mandarin Chinese. Do you have the same difficulty in dealing with German data or other linguistic data?
Oh yeah, thanks for these questions. They are kind of related because they also, I think, remind us that all these things are very strongly language dependent. So first of all, of course, there are differences between languages when it comes to the productivity of certain word formation patterns, but also there are, of course, differences in the resources we have available for different languages. And yeah, for English, for example, we have lots and lots of resources. For German, it used to be very different, like 10, 15 years ago. So when I started with my linguistic career, we had very few resources, especially when it comes to diachrony, and we had very small corpora. So now we're in a much better situation and we have much more data, but of course there are still many languages for which we still don't have any resources, any big resources, or in some cases any resources that would allow for doing anything remotely as complex as what I presented. And of course that's also something that is a challenge when we want to compare, for example, to what extent the tentative tendencies that we can see in languages like German, English, and to some extent Chinese regarding productivity when it comes to the question of whether they can be generalized to other languages or even to all languages. So yeah, that's, I think, a very important reminder. I'm afraid I don't have a concrete answer to that question, but I can. But of course, we when it comes to going back in time, we always face the problem that we have less and less data the further back we go, and in some languages this problem arises earlier, in others it arises later, in terms of the time you can go back, basically. But we do have the same problems in the sense that when it comes to assessing, for example, first attestations, the data, of course, get more and more unreliable the more we go back in time. And I think that's also one of the more philosophical problems that we are faced with in linguistics, and that also present a challenge that we can face with the triangulation of different methods, which is that language itself is, of course, an elusive phenomenon, and the ways of capturing language are usually fairly recent innovations like writing, or more recently audio and video recording. But of course, the object of our study itself is a very elusive thing, and there will always be the question to what extent even the best corpora that we have are available for everyday language use, and to what extent we can actually draw conclusions about what is kind of represented in our mind from written data or from audio and video data. So yeah, but that would probably be a talk in its own right to address these questions.
Thank you so much for sharing your own experience in doing research. This is very thought-provoking, and it also reminds me that we should be very cautious in choosing the research topic. For instance, the construction that we want to explore in diachronic studies. Thank you.
Thank you. I just saw that there's another question in the chat, and that's also a very interesting one. So when I count the Hapax frequencies of a certain construction in the corpus of historical American English, for example, there are quite a few typos and proper names. In that case, do you think it would be possible to come up with a working definition of productivity based on dyslegomena or trislegomena rather than hapax-legomena? Yeah, that's also a very interesting question, because and I think it's two topics that are kind of related, but also two different issues. So on the one hand, of course, we have many typos, and especially when we have historical data, we often have more spelling variation than we have in synchronic data. And so, of course, this makes it more complicated to work with measures that are, for example, Hapax-based. At the same time, it's also true that focusing on hapax-legomena is not always the best way to go, because, as you say, words that occur twice or three times, so dyslegomena or trislegomena, could be just as informative as hapax-legomena are. And so that's also something that has been proposed in the literature, that we kind of extend the scope of these traditional measures of productivity so that they don't just take hapax-legomena into account, but also other indicators like, as you say, dyslegomena or trislegomena, or totally different things like first attestations and things like that. Yeah, but I think it's definitely something that we have to keep in mind when trying to operationalize productivity based on such measures.
Thank you, Dr. Jack Meng, and thank you, Professor Hartmann, for your answer. I have a second question, which is also related to the different levels of productivity on the different levels. That is, for the 3 different levels, do we need to, in our, for instance, in our case studies, we need to deal with the productivity on the 3 levels as a whole, or in one case study, we just need to focus on one level? Do you have any suggestions?
I'm not sure if we can always tease them apart in the operationalization of productivity, but I do think we should think about the levels that we are taking into account. So, for example, when we take a look at the productivity of a specific pattern and how it develops over time, we should, of course, keep in mind that there can be certain outliers because there are individual differences between authors, but in the end, we will probably have to operationalize it from a bird's eye perspective, basically, and take everything into account that we have. So in that case, it's more of it's a matter of keeping it in the back of our minds that there are different levels, and that they might, to some extent, or that in the particular case that we are investigating, maybe some of the data points might be more informative about one of the levels than about the others. At the same time, when it comes to individual productivity versus other levels of productivity, I think it also has to do with different methodological approaches. So when it comes to the question of what individuals know about specific constructional patterns, and in the end, productivity is one aspect of constructional knowledge, then maybe psycholinguistic methods are more appropriate to investigate that than corpus linguistic methods. Although, that being said, there are interesting studies that kind of try to reconstruct the minds of individuals, basically based on corpus linguistic methods. So I already mentioned this study by Jakob Niels on William Faulkner. There's also an interesting study by Hans-Dirk Schmid and Mandlik, I've forgotten her first name, who try to, as they call it, reconstruct the minds of dead authors from corpus data. So they kind of try to assess degrees of entrenchment by taking a look at corpus data and taking individual differences into account. And there's lots of other, especially recent work that tries to take individual difference into account that can maybe also be informative for productivity. Yeah, but now I lost track and I didn't answer your question. But I think the answer is that, yeah, as I said, we can't always tease the different levels apart, and so we should only be aware of the fact that there are different levels on which not only productivity, but in general constructional levels is constructional knowledge is situated. And I think whenever we talk about constructions, we should try to be as clear as possible about the level of abstraction we are talking about. So are we talking about the individual level of linguistic knowledge, or are we talking about some abstraction over the linguistic knowledge of many language users? I think that's the main point.
Thank you so much, especially for thank you for recommending the literature. Yes, actually, the paper about William Faulkner, we within our research group, we discussed the paper a lot and learned a lot. Also, we learned much in your talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, due to the time limit, we have one last question from Jiang Yeye from Sichuan International Studies University.
Oh, yeah. Could you elaborate on the complementary measure of productivity in the dimension of productivity? Oh, yeah, that's, yeah, maybe I didn't make this clear enough. So the idea was that we have different ways of measuring productivity, and the idea is that they are complementary in the sense that we can only understand productivity if we take a look at these different measures together. So in my example, I had token frequency, type frequency, which is also called realized productivity, and potential productivity, so this Hapax-based measure of productivity. And they complement each other in the sense that they measure different aspects and different dimensions of productivity. And similarly, we could argue that other methods that have been proposed more recently, like, for example, neologism-based measures of productivity, or more sociologically oriented measures, like, for example, the measures that Tanya Saley has proposed, they all basically capture different parts of the jigsaw puzzle, basically, that allow for a big picture of productivity, and that allow us to kind of see the full picture, more or less, and to understand what a language user knows that knows a particular construction.
Thank you, Professor Hartmann, for answering this question, and thank you, Jiang Yeye, for asking this question. I think now we can call it a day. Thank you again, Professor Hartmann.
Thank you.
Later we will.
Thank you.
Thomas, do you have any comments, or just say goodbye to Professor Hartmann? And
the only thing I want to say, thank you very much, Professor Hartmann. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Later, we will post the video recording to our WeChat platform as well as the YouTube channel. I will set the link to you in the email.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
好，谢谢大家。